All right, what's up, guys? I'm back today, and today we're going to be talking about the best UFC fighters to never win a UFC belt. That's right. And yeah, let's get right into it. You see him on the screen, Dustin Poirier, arguably the best UFC fighter to never win a belt. He's fought for the belt 3 times, and man, talk about 3 hard title fights. Charles Oliveira, one of the best grapplers in history, and then Khabib and Islam, the first and second greatest lightweight of all time. Man, Dustin Poirier just got unlucky in the era he fought in. But if you take a look at his notable wins, this dude has fought and beat a lot of good guys. He beat Benoit. He knocked out Benoit St. Denis. He choked out Michael Chandler. He knocked out Conor McGregor 2 times. He fought to a decision war with Dan Hooker. Submitted Max Holloway and busted him up in the second fight. He TKO'd Eddie Alvarez. He TKO'd Justin Gaethje. He body triangled Anthony Pettis and broke his rib, I believe. He fought Jim Miller to a decision, and he knocked out Bobby Green. Dustin Poirier is the cream of the crop of lightweights and still doing the damn thing at 35 years old. Listen, he just had a very impressive showing against Islam Makhachev at UFC 302. I know he lost and he got outboxed, but man, did he look good in his takedown defense department. And he's just looked good overall in his entire career. Now, he just was never good enough to get to the pinnacle of the sport and get the belt, but he did win the interim belt, which is awesome for him. I know it's not the undisputed, but hey, he beat Max Holloway, who was on like a 13-fight win streak at the time, so he well earned that interim belt, I'd say. And yeah, Dustin Poirier, easily one of my favorite fighters. Another fun fact, unfortunately for Dustin, is that he was submitted in all 3 title fights. He was rear naked choked by Charles Oliveira and Khabib, and then I think it was a Bravo choke from Islam Makhachev after that insane trip. But nonetheless, he's one of the greatest lightweights of all time. Easily the greatest lightweight to never win the UFC belt, and one of the best UFC fighters to ever fight to not win a belt. And yeah, we all know we're just waiting on that Conor McGregor 4 red panty night, yeah? Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. The next good UFC fighter to never win a belt, Tony Ferguson. Now listen, I know he's on an 8-fight skid right now, but at one point, Tony Ferguson was 25-3 overall and 15-1 in the UFC. And man, was that 12-fight win streak a thing of beauty. He was busting up everybody. He finished Edson Barboza. That was brutal. He outworked Rafael dos Anjos. He triangled Kevin Lee. He beat Anthony Pettis, I think, by doctor stoppage, and then he swelled Donald Cerrone's eyes shut before losing to Justin Gaethje and going on his insane losing streak. But man, Tony Ferguson coming up on that 12-fight win streak. His cardio, his submissions. I do think people overrated Tony's wrestling defense a lot in his career. He's always shown to be easily taken down, but man, when there's a picture that goes around, you know the picture, and it just shows Tony Ferguson like cutting everybody up in the picture, and that was just always insane to see. Like before this guy's losing streak, he was one of the most insane lightweights on the planet, and it's a shame he never got to fight Khabib. That fight was put together 5 different times and got canceled. It was never meant to happen. He did win the interim belt at one point, just like Dustin Poirier when he beat Kevin Lee. So at the very least, he was an interim champion. He just never could reach that top spot. I always wish we could see Tony Ferguson versus Conor McGregor in his prime whenever he called him out. That'd have been awesome. I do think Conor probably would have beat him. But who knows, man? Tony was a beast up until he was like 36 years old, 35 years old. He was a beast. He had unlimited cardio. He had an insane chin, insane recovery. Actually, his chin, he was a little chinny, but his recovery was so good it didn't even matter. And he never got tired. They didn't call him the boogeyman in the division for nothing. So, Tony Ferguson, another amazing fighter to never win a UFC belt. And I mean undisputed belt when I say that. I know he's won interim. Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. None other than Donald Cowboy Cerrone. Listen, Cowboy, he had one of the most extensive, longest UFC careers. Fought in the UFC 37 times. And man, he had a couple runs. He beat. Let's look at his notable wins. UFC record of 23-14. He beat Ali Quinta, Alexander Hernandez. He submitted Mike Perry. He head kicked Matt Brown. I think he head kicked Patrick Cote as well. Benson Henderson. He beat Eddie Alvarez. He beat by a close decision. Head kicked Jim Miller, I believe. Edson Barboza. I think he submitted him. And Charles Oliveira. I think he TKO'd him back in the day. And he beat Jeremy Stephens as well. Listen, there was a point where Cowboy was like on an 8-fight win streak, and he fought Rafael dos Anjos for the belt. It's unfortunate he didn't beat Rafael dos Anjos, but that 8-fight win streak and him coming close to the belt, we all know Cowboy choked up a lot when he got to the upper echelon of the divisions. But nonetheless, impressive fighter, always entertaining, always went for the finish, and I respect that. He has so many finishes in the UFC. I love fighters that finish the fight and don't just coast to a decision. Marab, hello. But yeah, you get the point. Cowboy Cerrone's now talking about coming back. Cowboy, please stay retired, dude. We don't want to see a 41-year-old Cowboy get smoked in the octagon when it would have never happened before. Nearly 42, by the way. But yeah, Cowboy Cerrone, one of the best UFC fighters to never win a belt, arguably. Octagon legend. Second most wins in UFC history. Just an insane resume all around. Let's move on to the next best UFC fighters to never win a belt. Yoel Romero. Now listen, Yoel Romero's UFC career was a lot shorter than people think. He actually didn't get into the UFC until he was like 35, I believe. But some notable wins. He beat an out-of-prime Thiago Santos, but he beat Luke Rockhold, which arguably he should have won the belt, but he missed weight, which was unfortunate because being that he missed weight, that disqualified him from winning the belt. So he knocked out Luke Rockhold, and then the belt was vacant. That was very unfortunate. And then he went on to lose twice to Robert Whittaker. But he flying knee KO'd Chris Weidman. He beat Jacare by decision. He KO'd Lyoto Machida. He controversially KO'd Tim Kennedy after his whole stool gate. But Tim Kennedy was cheating that fight as well. And he KO'd Derek Brunson. Listen, Yoel, one of the scariest specimens to ever fight in the UFC. This dude's body's made of like titanium. Like, this guy needs to be studied in the lab. He also fought successfully into his 40s. Like, he arguably beat Israel Adesanya in his 40s. I know a lot of people go back and forth who won that fight. I did think Israel Adesanya won that fight, but that was a really close fight. It was boring, but obviously frustrating to watch. But a UFC record of 9-4, arguably should have won the belt whenever he fought Luke Rockhold, but he disqualified himself by not making weight. Yoel's a legend. He's like 47 now and still fighting, so respect. But he probably should retire at that age. Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. The next best fighter to never win a UFC belt, but almost, is Alexander Gustafsson. Listen, 10-8 UFC record, not the best, but he did take a lot of losses towards the end of his career. He was probably out of his prime. Notable wins, man, that three-piece uppercut combination against Glover Teixeira and to a knockout was one of the most beautiful striking knockouts I've ever seen. And he has a win over Jan Blachowicz, which I actually forgot about. That's very impressive in hindsight, being that Jan went on to become champion. Jimmy Manuwa, he has a win over, which was good at the time. And then Shogun, which was also good at the time. And let's not forget, this guy gave John Jones one of his hardest fights ever in 2013. Arguably beat John Jones. I do think John Jones won that fight, but it was close, and I wouldn't mind it going to Gustafsson. He also had an insanely close championship fight against DC. That fight was crazy. Gustafsson actually took DC down in that fight. And then, he had some losses against like Anthony Johnson, and he had some losses against John Jones in the rematch again. And he got submitted later on by Fabricio Verdum. So he definitely fought past his prime, but Alexander Gustafsson, man, at one point, he was the mauler for a reason. This guy was a legend. Respect. Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. Another UFC legend to never win a UFC belt, but man, did he come close a couple times. Not come close, but he's fought for the belt, I think, 4 times. He fought for the belt twice against DJ and twice against Davison Figueiredo. And man, I got to say, he got brutalized by Figueiredo. That was maybe one of the only 10-7 rounds in UFC history. But Joseph Benavidez, he beat Husier Formiga twice, Alex Perez. He beat Henry Cejudo. A lot of people forget that. It was a close fight, but he did win a split decision against Henry Cejudo. Beat Tim Elliott, beat Ian McCall, who was really good back in the day. Listen, man. Joseph Benavidez, good fighter. He just, whenever he reached the championship fights, he just couldn't get it done, man. But one of the best flyweights to ever do it, and one of the best UFC fighters to never win a belt. A lot of people overlook this guy because, flyweight is kind of a newer division, and it's not as exciting as a lot of the other divisions, but man, this guy was a staple in the flyweight division. He was a perennial contender, and yeah, respect to Joe B. Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, a UFC record of 12-8. Listen, Wonderboy's recent run's kind of sad. He's 1-4 in his last 5, but man, whenever this guy was in his prime, even recently outside of his prime, he destroyed Kevin Holland. I know Kevin Holland's not that impressive, and he probably could have beat Stephen Thompson if he'd have just took him down. But he also pieced up Jeff Neal. He destroyed Vicente Luque, pieced up Jorge Masvidal, destroyed Rory McDonald, destroyed Johnny Hendricks, and knocked out Robert Whittaker way back in the day. He also had 2 extremely close title fights with Tyron Woodley. And yeah, man, if he wouldn't have got knocked down in those Woodley fights, he probably could have took the fight off of Woodley. One of the fights was a decision for Woodley, and the other one was a majority draw. So close to winning the belt, man. So close, but he just missed it. If Wonderboy, imagine if Wonderboy had a submission game, he probably would have been the greatest welterweight of all time. But that's an alternate universe. All he had was striking, and it showed, man. But his striking was the cream of the crop, the best. Now he's on a downslide. I'd like to see him retire at 41 years old. He's a legend of the game. No need to take any more damage. Respect to Wonderboy. Yeah, man. One of my favorite fighters to watch. So entertaining. Let's move on to the next guy on the list. Colby Covington. Now, I know a lot of people don't hold Colby Covington in high regard these days just because of his antics and his lack of activity he's held throughout his entire career. He could make a comeback and fight Ian Gary, but he's just making the whole process hard. But he's got some good notable wins against Jorge Masvidal. He beat him pretty comfortably over decision. And then Tyron Woodley, he busted him up until he broke his rib in the 5th round. Outworked Robbie Lawler, outworked Rafael dos Anjos. And the start of his rise was when he busted up Damen Maia, which was a really good win at the time. Colby Covington also came razor close to winning the belt. He had the first Usman fight where it was 2-2 going into the 5th, but then he got busted up by some back of the head shots that Mark Goddard didn't call. No, he lost. He got TKO'd by Usman in the first fight. And then in the second fight with Usman, it was a really close fight. He held up, but Usman pulled away in the later rounds, and Colby lost another close decision to Usman. And then he fought Leon Edwards a few years later, which was an undeserved title shot. So he is 0-3 in title fights, but man, that fight against Leon Edwards was embarrassing. I'm not going to lie. He looked like a shell of himself. He said apparently he came into the fight with a foot injury, but no excuses, man. Colby Covington, I think he wasted a lot of his prime sitting on the sidelines. He should have fought more. He's 36 now, soon to be 37 in February, I believe. So, yeah, he's definitely out of his prime. I don't think he beats much of the top fighters in the welterweight division at this point, but he had a good run, 12-4 UFC record, got really close to the title. Respect to Colby Covington, even if his antics were annoying at times. Respect. Let's move on to another fighter. Nick Diaz. Listen, Nick Diaz in the UFC specifically was not too impressive, but outside the UFC, man, his boxing plus his jiu-jitsu made for such an entertaining and dangerous style at one time. I think there was a time where he was on an 11-fight win streak, but most of that was outside the UFC. Honestly, his Anderson Silva win got overturned because of marijuana, so technically his last win is in 2011, which is 13 years ago. That's an insane stat, but I think he'd give him the win against Anderson Silva. Weed doesn't help you in fights. He got a win over BJ Penn, Paul Daly, Gleason Tebow, and funny enough, I didn't notice Frank Shamrock. I didn't even know Nick Diaz fought Frank Shamrock. That's an interesting stat. But Nick Diaz, man, listen, I know he got outworked by GSP in his only title fight. He got outworked pretty easily over 5 rounds. But man, whenever this guy's boxing was on point, it was insane to see. And he had some insane submissions. I remember he got a Gogo Plata. Forgot who it might have been over Takanori Gomi. I don't know. Correct me on that, but he got a Gogo Plata on somebody, which is an insanely rare submission. UFC record wasn't the best, 7-7. I think his best days were definitely in Strikeforce. But either way, one of the most legendary and best fighters to never win a UFC belt. I stand by that. Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. We got Chad Money Mendes. Listen, Chad Mendes, respect, one of the most entertaining fighters, even when he went to bare knuckle to fight Eddie Alvarez. An insane fight. He was definitely juiced up for that fight. 9-5 UFC record, notable wins, Ricardo Lamas, Clay Guida, Darren Elkins, Cody McKenzie, and Cub Swanson. Chad Mendes, he also had a title fight with McGregor, which, man, felt like at one point when he had McGregor on the ground, he could have scrambled for that submission and got him, but no, took that fight on short notice and ended up getting stopped. He also fought to an insanely close decision against Jose Aldo in their second fight, man. A lot of people think he won that fight, but I did get that fight to Aldo. And he got destroyed by Aldo in the first fight. But Aldo did grab defense before he kneed him in the face. So, Chad Mendes, legendary featherweight career. Fought for the interim belt once and fought for the undisputed twice. So, he was 0-3 in title fights. But, man, was he entertaining to watch. Always came with heavy power and heavy pressure, looking to throw some bombs at you. And, yeah, I really enjoyed watching Mendez's fights. And I think he hung it up at a correct time when he was 38. He hung it up, which is a good age. Maybe a lot of fighters in the lower weight classes should probably hang it up around 36 to 38, I think. It's a good age. But, yeah, let's move on to the next fighter on this list. Dan Henderson. Now, good old Dan Hendo. He didn't have the best record in the UFC, 9-9, but man, this guy is a legendary MMA fighter. I mean, Dan Henderson fought everybody. He won titles in Strikeforce. I think he was a double champ in Strikeforce, middleweight and light heavyweight, if I'm not mistaken. He beat notable wins: Hector Lombard, Tim Bosch, beat Shogun twice, and those Shogun fights were some of the most insane fights you'll ever see. If you haven't seen him, go watch him. He actually beat Fedor, which was insane at the time. He knocked out Michael Bisping, one of the most legendary knockouts at UFC 100. Beat Rich Franklin, knocked out Vanderlei Silva, and I think he knocked out Vitor Belfort back in the day. So yeah, Dan Henderson with the H-bomb. If you got hit by the H-bomb, you probably were going to sleep. And even at 46 years old, when he got that title shot against Michael Bisping, obviously he shouldn't have, but man, he busted up Michael Bisping. If the rules then were by damage, he would have won that fight. Imagine 46-year-old Dan Henderson becoming champion and then retiring. That'd have been like one of the most wholesome send-off moments ever. But nonetheless, Dan Henderson, legendary career. It was sad to see him at the end of his career get ragdolled by Daniel Cormier, but, you know, the passing of the torch has to happen eventually. Let's move on to the next fighter on this list. The next fighter, another good fighter to never win a belt in the UFC, Alistair Overeem. Man, Alistair Overeem has an insane resume. Let's look at it. 12-8 UFC record. So he had a good bit of losses in the UFC, but man, he had some insane wins. Knocked out Walt Harris, knocked out Alexei Oleinik. First man to finish Sergey Pavlovich in the octagon. A lot of people don't know that. He finished him in Sergey's debut. He has 2 wins over Fabricio Verdum, I think both by knockout. He has 2 wins over Mark Hunt, 1 submission, 1 knockout. He beat Andrei Arlovsky by KO, I believe. Knocked out Roy Nelson, knocked out Stefan Struve. Made a decision against Frank Mir, I believe. Destroyed Brock Lesnar. And he beat Vitor Belfort twice. And he was an insane kickboxer. And dude, the impressive thing about Overeem is the amount of finishes he has. This dude has an insane amount of submissions and knockouts on his record. So Overeem was never one to go to a decision. Like, this man was looking to finish fights and get people out of there. And as a lot of these people on these lists, whenever he fought Stipe Miocic at UFC 203, I believe, 203, and he knocked Stipe or cracked Stipe and had him in that guillotine, and he said he clearly felt the tap. Man, that was a close guillotine, but Stipe had some insane submission defense. But man, is he one of the best UFC fighters to never win a belt. Alistair Overeem, one of the most legendary heavyweight careers ever. Definitely a UFC Hall of Famer. I don't even know if he's been inducted yet, but let me know on that. But yeah, this dude, I loved watching his fights. You already know if you watched the Alistair Overeem fight, he was either going to KO somebody or get KO'd. That's just what it was, especially in the UFC. So respect to Alistair Overeem or Ubereem. Let's move on to the next fighter. The next fighter to never win a UFC belt that was insanely good. Rumble Johnson, a 13-6 UFC record. First of all, rest in peace to Rumble Johnson. His life came to an end, sadly, and a couple years ago. He fought it. He was a warrior, but his octagon presence was insane. Some of the most scary knockouts you'll ever see. Remember whenever he KO'd Glover Teixeira in like 12 seconds, and then Ryan Bader shit the bed fighting Rumble? He was so terrified, he ended up getting pummeled out on the ground. He knocked out Jimmy Manuel. He knocked out Alexander Gustafsson in Stockholm, Sweden, I believe. KO'd Antonio Nogueira. Busted up Phil Davis, and even has a win over Arlovsky. Listen, Rumble was one of the scariest heavyweights to ever fight in the UFC. It's pound for pound, some of the best power we've ever seen in the UFC history. This dude's power was insane. He sent Daniel Cormier flying across the octagon in their first fight. That was insane. And imagine if he'd have KO'd Daniel Cormier and became the champ and then KO'd John Jones. Anthony Rumble Johnson, the GOAT. But no, respect to Rumble. Like I said, some of the most scary power you'll ever see in any pound-for-pound weight class. So, yeah, Rumble, another amazing fighter to never win a UFC belt. Let's move on to the second-to-last fighter on this list. The GOAT, the undefeated, undisputed, Chael Sonnen. Listen, Chael Sonnen, 7-7 in the UFC, not the best record. Notable wins, he beat Rampage Jackson. He has a win over Vanderlei way late in his career. A win over Shogun and a win over Michael Bisping. Now, the thing about Chael is the legendary first fight against Anderson Silva. Listen, man, he beat Anderson Silva pillar to post for 4.5 rounds, and then he got subbed by a triangle. In true Chael Sonnen fashion. And he proceeded to say he thought the round ends if you tap, not the fight. Obviously, he was trolling. But, man, Chael Sonnen, he came so close to winning that belt. But in the second fight against Anderson, he got absolutely destroyed. And then after the UFC, he went on to have a career in Bellator, which was not the best. His Bellator run was pretty sad. He lost to freaking He lost to a super old Fedor. He lost to Tito Ortiz and some other fighters. But yeah, the GOAT, Chael Sonnen, will never forget his UFC run. His trash talk is what made his career what it is. He even fought John Jones at one point. A lot of people don't know that. He got destroyed by John Jones in the first round. Because, John Jones was juiced out of his mind. So was Chael Sonnen. But yeah, respect to the undisputed GOAT, Chael Sonnen. Almost won that UFC belt, but you got caught up in a triangle. What happens, man? Let's move on to the last fighter to not win a UFC belt. Damen Maia. Listen, this guy is one of the most scary grapplers in UFC history. If you had Damen Maia on your back, bro, he's probably going to put you to sleep. He was the real backpack before Aljamain Sterling, the real backpack. He strangled Ben Askren in 2019. He controlled Jorge Masvidal, which that fight showed Jorge Masvidal actually had insane submission defense. He submitted Carlos Condit. He submitted Matt Brown. He busted up Gunnar Nelson on the ground. He submitted Neil Magny, and he beat Chael Sonnen back in the day. Damen Maia's 7-fight win streak leading up to the fight with Tyron Woodley was insane. That 7-fight win streak was so impressive. For him, a specialist, to not have the best striking and just to be able to dominate in his realm and take it where he wants. You see, that's the thing about the UFC in these days, that you can't dominate anymore with like being a specialist unless you're like Alex Pereira. And even then, he had to develop takedown defense. But most specialists these days, they get shut down. You got to just be well-rounded at MMA today. And back in his day, man, Damen Maia made it work. Not to mention, he has 33 fights in the UFC with 22 wins. That's really insane. And yeah, he got to a title shot against Tyron Woodley, and that fight was a snooze fest. Tyron Woodley stuffed all 22 of his takedowns, and he really had nothing else for Tyron Woodley. So I can't say he came close to winning the belt, and he lost to Anderson Silva in a title fight. He tried twice, and he failed, but he tried. Legendary career for Damen Maia. That's all the fighters today, in my opinion, that were the best that ever won a UFC belt. Let me know if I missed anybody in the comments. Who would you add to this list? Do you agree or disagree with my takes? And thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. Peace.